Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Lincoln Riley, this USC football program, make another massive addition to the front office going into 2025, and former Wisconsin director of player personnel and general manager Max Stienecker. Max Stienecker, we're going to get into Max Stienecker and what he's done both at his time at Cincinnati and at Wisconsin. The short story is he's considered one of the fastest risers in terms of front office members in the landscape of college football. Can we just sit back and talk about what USC is doing when it comes to roster management and roster building? And this was a program that 6 months ago, from a front office standpoint, was probably one of the worst in the country. It was a very, very, very little organization. It seemed like there was very, very little direction and vision in terms of how they wanted this USC roster to look like. Dave Emmerich, I don't think, did a great job. But, secondly, USC just wasn't investing that much resources into building the front office. And then you fast forward to the beginning of February in 2025, and you're sitting back and saying USC is putting all the pieces in place to have one of the best front offices that you see in all of college football. In fact, it might be the best front office that you see in college football as we sit right now. And one of my biggest takeaways is this is a USC program that, in my opinion, in terms of roster building, talent acquisition, it can be one of the best programs across the country. But you have to get the pieces in place for USC to maximize that potential. 6 months ago, it was a disaster. The pieces were very clearly not in place. You fast forward to where we sit in February of 2025 and say all the pieces are in place. And as a college football fan just sitting back, I can't wait to see what USC does from a talent acquisition and roster building standpoint heading into the next couple of months on the recruiting trail in the spring transfer portal window. This is a really big story. You know what? If you follow the landscape of college football, especially over the last couple of years, it's always been about the Jimmies and Joes, right? If you can get bigger, faster, stronger football players, a more talented football team than the team that you're playing, you're going to put yourself in a really good chance to win. That's where it starts. But in this modern era of college football with NIL, with the transfer portal, it's been a lot harder for staffs to kind of manage rosters. You want to have a strong front office. I will stand on this and say it's arguably one of the most important aspects to get right as a college football program. USC sparing no expense in terms of building an elite front office. And you can see it with their actions, right? They go out and land Notre Dame's general manager, Chad Bowden. That was kind of the start of things. In my opinion, one of the best general managers that we see in the country. Then you go out and land his right-hand man in Dre Brown coming over from, Dre Brown coming over from Illinois, who was the director of player personnel at Illinois, essentially the sitting general manager at Illinois. And then you go out and land Wisconsin's director of player personnel and sitting general manager in Max Stienecker. You're building a front office that, in my opinion, is elite. And another thing that stands out is these are all guys that Chad Bowden knows and trusts. Right, obviously, Chad Bowden worked with Dre Brown at his time at Notre Dame. You look at Max Stienecker. Max Stienecker worked for Chad Bowden at Cincinnati with Luke Fickell, who was doing a really, really good job in terms of building talent at Cincinnati during Luke Fickell's tenure. It's a front office that, number one, has just a lot of good members to it. And then secondly, they're all going to be on the same page. And that was something that you look at USC 6 months ago. It did not seem like Lincoln Riley, Dave Emmerich, and the rest of the USC staff kind of had their ducks in a row. They certainly were not on the same page. You got a really strong front office that all kind of sees roster building, has the same vision for this USC football program. They're all going to be moving in the same direction. Really important aspect about building the front office out. Now, I want to get a little bit into Max Stienecker. Talked about what he did at Cincinnati. Talked about what he does what he did at Wisconsin. And then I want to have just a short conversation about what do we expect from this USC program going into the spring transfer portal window. Before we get into it, as always, the USC fans, this is not national media type stuff, but I personally had just an absolute blast talking about what USC is doing in the front office. This is going to have a massive impact in terms of how we talk about this USC program on the recruiting trail over the next couple of months. Cannot thank the USC fans enough for rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, Max Stienecker, a really young kid. I believe he's under 30 years old. He certainly looks at it in this picture, or looks it in this picture, but largely considered one of the best in the business. And you kind of look at what he did, not only at Cincinnati, where you look at that Cincinnati program, say nowhere near the potential that USC has in terms of talent acquisition. Their evaluations and their roster management under Coach Luke Fickell was elite. That was a G5 program at the time that was competing at a high level in the Power Four landscape, making the college football playoffs. So in terms of what Max Steinecker's been a part of at Cincinnati, in terms of building that roster, really, really impressive. The evaluations were really good. A lot of three-star guys that were kind of overlooked by Power Four programs that were added to Cincinnati became NFL draft picks. Then you look at his time at Wisconsin. I was kind of playing around with, all right, what has Wisconsin done the last two recruiting cycles with Max Steinecker essentially at the helm of roster management? What stands out is a really nice blend between high school recruiting and in the transfer portal, right? Top 25 classes for Wisconsin on the recruiting trail, top 25 consistently in the transfer portal as well. Then you start to scroll down some of their top commitments. Line of scrimmage, right? Kevin Haywood, a guy that I absolutely loved when he committed to Wisconsin. Ernest Willer, Dylan Jones, Dylan Johnson. That was the guy that I really liked on the defensive line. Big time emphasis on line of scrimmage players. Then you look at 2025, very similar story. Top 25 on the high school recruiting trail, top 12 in transfer portal rankings. Line of scrimmage has always been a priority. The two things that stood out to me when I'm looking at Wisconsin and looking at what they did in terms of building their roster, they prioritized the line of scrimmage at the high school ranks, very similar to how Chad Bowden operated during his time at Notre Dame. And you did a really good job blending, hey, we want to make sure we're building our roster at the high school recruiting trail, but we're not going to ignore the transfer portal, and we're going to make some really good additions. Both years, Wisconsin was sitting top 25 in both the high school recruiting trail and in the transfer portal, which tells me Wisconsin had a nice blend of how they wanted to go about building this roster. This is a USC program, and this is kind of how I sum up this conversation. A USC football program that we know because we've seen it. We've seen the ceiling of USC, especially when it comes to talent acquisition. It has all the potential in the world. But in order to realize that potential, you have to put the pieces in place in the front office. They have done so over the last couple of weeks. It started with Chad Bowden. Then you go out and land Illinois' essential general manager, and then you land Wisconsin. You got three former general managers of football programs all working for this USC front office. It's going to pay off on the recruiting trail, in the transfer portal, fundraising for NIL, player retention, all the most important things that you talk about in terms of building a roster. It's going to pay dividends for USC. And you just look at this program and say, you feel really good about the coaching staff and some of the changes that Lincoln Riley has made over the last 24 months. Now you feel really good about the front office too. It just seems like all the pieces are coming in place for this USC program to start firing on all cylinders. And what I love the most is they went out and hired Chad Bowden, which was a huge splash. And we talked about it. They turned around and said, hey, Chad Bowden, what do you need from us in order to maximize this program in terms of talent acquisition? Chad Bowden probably said, hey, I want Max Steinecker and I want Dre Brown. USC, there you go. All the pieces are in place for Chad Bowden to really get this thing off the ground from a talent acquisition standpoint. That's where it starts. If you don't have talent acquisition right, you're not going to be competing for college. I don't care how good the coaching staff is. If you do not acquire the talent, you ain't going to compete for college football playoffs and national championships. The coaching staff's in place. Front office talent acquisition, I think, is in place. Let's see how it looks for the next 24 months. And I think it's probably worth having a conversation real quick about, all right, the spring transfer portal window to me is going to be really exciting. We're going to get to see this new front office, so to speak, get to work. We'll talk about this more as the time comes. Where might USC look to address in the transfer portal? I first look at the offensive line and say, I like some of the moves that USC did, but with the Chad Bowden influence, with the Max Steinecker influence, two guys that we know want deep, talented line of scrimmage play, I would predict that USC is a big player for offensive linemen in the transfer portal. Would not be surprised to see USC try to add just a little bit more talent and depth at the wide receiver spot, because if you're potentially going to start a true freshman, Hassan Longstreet, make sure you give him the weapons around him and make sure you give him a good offensive line that can give Hassan Longstreet a good run game and that can keep him clean in the pocket. So on the offense side of the football, look at wide receivers, offensive line, probably the two that you're looking at. Then you scroll to the defensive side of the football, and I'll start with this. I love what USC's done on the defensive line in the portal. I actually look at the defensive line unit and say it might be one of the best units on this USC football team, which is crazy to say because 6 months ago it was probably one of the worst. Now it's a strength. You look at the linebacker and say we like the talent, probably want to add a little bit more depth. And that's something that's always been important to Chad Bowden too. You look at that team at Notre Dame in 2024. Yes, they were a very talented football team, but they were also a very deep football team too that dealt with a lot of injuries in 2024, but never really kind of skipped a beat. I would project that, yeah, USC will probably make some splashes for some big names, but look for Chad Bowden in this new front office to really address some of the depth concerns that we have for USC as well. We'll pause there. I can't wait. I really can't wait for seeing what the 2026 class looks like on the high school recruiting trail, seeing what the spring transfer portal window looks like for USC. It's going to be fun. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.